Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Tombstone. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1881. Tombstone, Arizona was already straining under its own contradictions. Silver wealth poured from its mines, yet law and order seemed always one step away from collapse. That year is remembered most for the violent confrontation near the OK Corral, when Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and others clashed with the cowboys. Historians trace every bullet from that fight, but behind the noise of gunfire, quieter mysteries were forming in the shadows of Fremont Street. On the edge of town, a two-story wooden building stood where a blacksmith shop had once burned down. Rebuilt quickly, the structure became a boarding house and saloon, but not of the familiar, noisy sort. Its sign changed in recollection. Some old residents called it the Sister's Place, others, the Twisted Barroom. Surviving documents don't agree. What they do share are faint references to two women who ran it, remembered as sisters of striking resemblance. Testimonies recorded decades later describe them as tall, severe, always dressed in high-buttoned dark gowns. They served whiskey and simple meals, but their saloon was silent. No piano, no card tables, no laughter. A miner named Josiah Pike, in a note recovered from a family trunk, recalled, "There was no cheer in that house. One ate and drank, and one left, glad to be gone." The sisters arrived in Tombstone late in 1880, according to a Pima County clerk's ledger that simply states, "Two women of manner and reserve have registered intent for a boarding house. Their names were not written, or perhaps were lost to fire when later records burn. Their background remains elusive, possibly Irish immigrants or perhaps from the Midwest. What is certain is that they drew little attention at first." But as spring came, the disappearances began. The first, a cattle driver named William Drexler, was last seen stepping into the sisters' saloon. He never boarded the stagecoach he had paid for, nor appeared on any rail manifest leaving town. His absence drew little outcry. He had no family in Tombstone, and men wandered often in those days. By midsummer, two more names slipped quietly from the census rolls, a blacksmith's apprentice and a young gambler who had recently arrived from Prescott. Both were last seen drinking stew and whiskey at the silent saloon. Neither was recorded again. Whispers began in back rooms. Neighbors spoke of footsteps pacing long after lamps went dark. Clara Morton, who lived across the street, later testified to hearing the trapdoor in the kitchen open and close in the small hours. She remembered, "It was no drunken stumbling, but measured tread, as if business was being carried out below." Still, Tombstone's lawmen, entangled in disputes that would soon ignite the OK Corral, had little patience for such stories. Sheriff John Behan was said to have remarked, "We've more urgent devils to wrangle than women serving stew." Yet for those who watched closely, the silence of that saloon grew more troubling than the gunfire that echoed across town. Tombstone was a town used to sudden death, but disappearances of this kind were harder to account for. A gunfight left bodies in the street. That was something a coroner could tally. But when men simply stopped appearing, the trail was faint, the accountability even fainter. The building that housed the sisters' saloon became central to whispers. Constructed on scorched ground after the blacksmith's fire of 1878, it was said to creak strangely in the night. Inside, the barroom contained little beyond 4 scarred tables, a narrow counter, and 3 rented rooms upstairs. The cellar, however, drew the most speculation. Accessed by a heavy trapdoor in the kitchen, it was seldom seen by customers. One teamster wrote in a letter, "Never sent." The air near the door was sour, as though something below was turning. The sisters themselves kept a reputation of strict order. They allowed no brawls, no gambling, and no singing. Men expecting typical saloon pleasures left uneasy, finding instead a house run with the discipline of a ledger. A miner described the women in his journal as tall, stern, and of one face, though there were 2 of them. They watched, as if measuring every move. By late 1881, the unease had reached Reverend Ellis Brooks, a traveling minister. He recorded in his diary being invited for supper at the saloon. He hoped to encourage respectability in a rough town, but his entry betrayed discomfort. Though the food was hearty, I felt ill at ease. The silence at table was heavy, the women speaking only to note the cost of whiskey. Their eyes, pale and steady, made me feel counted, weighed. Rumors soon followed that the sisters never purchased meat from local butchers, though their stew was always steaming. A neighbor swore that wagons arrived at night, unloading burlap sacks carried inside without a word. Some said it was supplies from Tucson. Others claim that it was worse. Sheriff Behan still dismissed concerns. With tensions between the Earps and the cowboys climbing, his office prioritized visible disputes. In the margin of one report, he scribbled, "Cannot spare deputies for gossip. Men leave this town every day." Yet one young deputy, Henry Lowe, made a note in his personal notebook after checking the census. Several names of boarders registered at the sisters' place had never reappeared elsewhere. Lowe wrote simply, "The numbers do not match." What remains unclear is why no formal inquiry followed. Some argue the distractions of the OK Corral consumed attention. Others suggest fear. Tombstone was already unstable, and officials may have feared igniting panic with rumors of vanishings tied to a saloon. But among townsfolk, the unease grew. Some swore they heard dragging sounds below the floorboards. Others claimed drunken men were led down the trapdoor and never seen again. In boarding houses across town, the phrase spread quietly, "The sisters serve more than whiskey." By the turn of winter, the tally of the missing had grown harder to ignore. The cattle driver, the gambler, the apprentice, all names quietly erased from Tombstone's daily bustle. A clerk in Tucson, reviewing stage manifests, noticed irregularities. Men who had paid fares never boarded. In the margin of his ledger he scrawled, "Last noted at the Sisters' Saloon, no departure recorded." That fragment is one of the few surviving written hints that something was amiss. Yet the sisters themselves carried on as if nothing were unusual. Patrons described them as unfailingly polite, though their manners carried a formality that unsettled. They asked no questions of travelers, never laughed at jokes, never drank themselves. A prospector later told his grandson, "They kept their hands folded, faces calm. You couldn't shake them from that quiet." It was the neighbors who began to press the issue more forcefully. Clara Morton, the woman across the street, swore she heard the cellar door creak open after midnight. She recalled in a later affidavit, "The sound was measured, never hurried, a tread that suggested work, not drink." Another local, a teamster named Elijah Grant, told a newspaperman that he once saw what looked like blood on the sisters' boots at dawn, though no record exists beyond his statement. Still, Sheriff Behan would not act. His office was tangled in disputes between the Earp brothers and the cowboys, a feud that would erupt in the gunfight at the OK Corral that very October. In the shadow of such violence, vanishing drifters attracted little resource. But the rumor mill did not rest. Miners who spent weeks underground said the stew served at the saloon tasted metallic, almost like iron. Others noted that no deliveries of beef were ever logged for the sisters' establishment. A butcher named Thomas Crane later testified, "They never bought cuts from me, nor from any I knew, yet their pot was always full." By December, a few townsfolk whispered openly of murder. Still others suggested darker things. Rituals whispered in the cellar, voices not belonging to the sisters echoing faintly in the night. These latter claims rest more in folklore than in law, but their persistence shows how deep the unease had grown. Reverend Brooks, the minister who had dined with the women, passed again through Tombstone before Christmas. In his second diary note he wrote, "I was asked once more to their table, but refused. I felt a weight upon my spirit at the thought of crossing that threshold again." Despite such accounts, there remained no formal charges, no arrests, no inquiry. The sisters' silence, coupled with Tombstone's distractions, gave them cover. But as the year closed, the whispers hardened into warnings. Do not lodge at the twisted barroom. Some who go in do not come out. As the new year dawned, the sisters' presence in Tombstone had become both familiar and avoided. They were figures always seen together, always composed, rarely speaking more than necessary. Some townsfolk said their likeness was so striking they seemed reflections rather than siblings. A merchant who sold them kerosene recalled, "They stood side by side in silence, and I could not tell which spoke. Their faces were near identical, their eyes pale and unwavering." The building they managed had a reputation distinct from every other saloon in town. Where most establishments rang with piano keys, gambling chips, and drunken songs, theirs was known for its oppressive stillness. Men entered expecting warmth or company and left unsettled, often after only a single drink. The contrast with Tombstone's rowdy culture made the silence all the more haunting. By spring, the count of missing travelers grew harder to dismiss. A local deputy, Henry Lowe, began keeping his own notes. In his small, leather-bound notebook he wrote, "Cross-checking census rolls with boarding records. At least 4 men unaccounted for. All last seen at Sister's place." Lowe's notes were never made official, but fragments survive, handed down through his family. Meanwhile, folklore around the saloon grew. Some miners claimed that after heavy rains, the soil behind the building turned soft, as though freshly disturbed. Coyotes were said to dig at the ground before being driven off. A prospector named James Holden swore he saw a human bone protruding from the earth one dawn, only to return later and find the soil freshly packed. His testimony was dismissed as drunken fancy. Inside the town's churches, whispers circulated that evil had taken root. Reverend Brooks, whose diary already noted unease, delivered a sermon on hidden sin, urging his congregation to beware houses where silence reigns louder than in song. Though he never named the sisters directly, parishioners understood the allusion. Yet still, no arrests followed. Sheriff Behan's resources were consumed by political struggles and rising violence between factions. Compared to open gunfights and cattle rustling, rumors of vanished drifters seemed less urgent. Officially, the disappearances were written off as wanderers who had left town unseen. Still, in the boarding houses, the warnings became more explicit. Travelers were told quietly, "Do not sleep under their roof, men vanish from there." And among miners at the Grand Central and Contention claims, a phrase began to circulate, "The sisters serve more than whiskey." That phrase would endure, echoing through decades of retellings, surviving long after the building itself was gone. By mid-1882, the whispers about the twisted barroom had hardened into a kind of collective caution. Stage drivers warned newcomers discreetly. Prospectors muttered over their whiskey that it was better to sleep under the open sky than inside that house. The building itself became an object of curiosity. A mason named Walter Briggs later testified that he had been asked to reinforce the saloon's flooring in early spring. He found the beams unusually thick, as if meant to bear weight far greater than ordinary foot traffic. Briggs recalled, "They said it was for storage, but I marked the cellar as deeper than most, and the air from it was foul." His account, preserved in a nephew's papers, was one of the first to mention structural oddities. Travelers, too, noted unsettling details. A man named Charles Latham wrote in a letter to his brother that he stayed a single night upstairs and could not rest. There were no sounds from the street, though Tombstone roared beyond. Only the tread of steps beneath, even after midnight, steady as if business were never done. By then, the tally of vanishings had risen beyond what gossip could contain. 6, possibly 7 men, all without strong local ties, were absent from records. A deputy constable filed a brief report on irregular lodging activity, but nothing further was pursued. The marshal's office, still fractured by tension surrounding the OK Corral aftermath, did not prioritize the matter. Some townsfolk attempted to rationalize. Perhaps the men had fled debts. Perhaps they joined mining camps under assumed names. But others whispered darker things. A young laundress told her friend she heard muffled cries on a windy night, coming from beneath the saloon. The story spread quickly, and though unverifiable, it added to the aura of menace. By autumn, even regular patrons had thinned. The saloon sat quieter than ever, as his windows often shuttered. Yet the sisters appeared undisturbed, continuing their routines with eerie calm. They were seen walking to fetch water, always side by side, always in step, never acknowledging the stares that followed them. It was around this time that a deputy's unsigned affidavit appeared in county files. The paper, charred at the edges from later fire damage, read only, "The numbers do not match. Too many gone. The sisters know more than they show." Whether that deputy pursued the matter further is unknown, but the affidavit stands as one of the few official acknowledgments that the unease was more than tavern talk. And yet, despite mounting suspicion, nothing broke the surface. The saloon endured, its doors still open, its pot still simmering, and its reputation growing darker with every vanished name. By winter, a sense of dread hung over Fremont Street. The saloon stood like any other building, but its silence carried more weight than the loudest taverns in Tombstone. Men walked past its doors without entering, choosing instead the rowdy Birdcage Theater or the Crystal Palace. Still, the sisters remained, always present, always watchful. In December, an assistant marshal named Daniel Hart filed a census check. He compared stage records against town registers and noted a series of discrepancies consistent with disappearance. Hart's notes, scrawled quickly, never expanded, ended with the chilling line, "Each last seen at the sisters." His record, found later in a bundle of unrelated documents, is one of the last known official mentions. Folklore claims that one cold night, townsfolk discovered soil disturbed behind the saloon. Coyotes had begun to dig, and something pale was glimpsed in the dirt. By dawn, the area was smoothed, as though freshly tamped down. No one filed a formal complaint, but the story endured. One prospector insisted for years afterward that he saw a human hand, bare to the wrist, before it was covered. The cellar became the focus of speculation. Some claimed to hear dragging sounds below the floorboards. Others described strange odors, stronger after rain, seeping up through cracks. Reverend Brooks, still passing through town, noted in his diary, "The stench of iron and dampness clung to that place. I was asked once more to call upon them, but I declined." Inside the kitchen stove, one boarder reported seeing papers burning late into the night. He thought them ledgers, thick with ink, but could not be sure. Another claimed to glimpse burlap sacks hauled through the trapdoor, too heavy for one man to carry. Despite this, no action was taken. Lawmen, consumed by feuds and shootings, brushed aside the rumors. To investigate vanishings meant combing through a transient population, many of whom had no kin to vouch for them. Easier perhaps to write them off as men who moved on. But among townsfolk, the saloon's reputation grew into certainty. A phrase was whispered with unease in the boarding houses: "They never buy meat, but the pot is never empty." The twisted barroom was no longer seen as an oddity. It was feared. And yet the sisters themselves remained untouchable, their composure unbroken, their house standing silent against the desert winds. Then, without warning, the sisters were gone. Sometime in the early months of 1882, the twisted barroom closed its doors. Patrons who wandered by found the shutters drawn, the windows boarded, and the sign above half torn from its hinges. No notice of departure was given, no farewell to customers. The house simply ceased to function overnight. County tax rolls for that year list the property as abandoned. Whatever names had been attached to it disappeared from the records, if they were ever written there at all. Within weeks, rumors swirled faster than ever before. Some claimed the sisters fled eastward under assumed names, boarding a train in disguise. Others whispered that vigilantes had driven them out quietly, preferring silence to scandal. A bartender named Horace Bell later testified in an interview with a newspaperman in the 1890s. They were seen no more after the thaw. Like smoke on the wind, they vanished. The building did not stay vacant for long. Ownership changed hands twice in as many years, though the deeds are incomplete and partly destroyed by later fires. Each new occupant attempted to repurpose the space, yet business never lasted. The atmosphere was said to be oppressive, customers avoiding the doorway even when music and lamps were brought in to cheer the rooms. By the late 1880s, a fire swept through that block, consuming the structure entirely. Whether sparked accidentally by a stove or intentionally set is unknown. No insurance records survive. What is certain is that the house was reduced to ash, and with it any chance of a thorough investigation. But the absence of the building only deepened the mystery. Without walls to point to, the whispers grew freer, filling the empty lot with stories. Some told of hidden ledgers discovered in the cellar before the fire, listing initials beside dates, as if accounting for men rather than debts. Oten. Hers swore that beneath the earth lay shallow graves, quickly swallowed by flames when the structure collapsed. No evidence survives beyond testimony and rumor. Yet even in the retelling, one truth remains consistent. The sisters departed as suddenly as the men they were said to have served, leaving Tombstone with more questions than answers. When the saloon was gone, the stories only multiplied. Without the building to anchor them, people began to fill the absence with memory and rumor. Around campfires in mining camps, men spoke of the silent house, where stew was served but never bought. At boarding houses, new arrivals were told in hushed voices, "Stay clear of the sisters' lot. Some who ate there never left." By the 1890s, the tale had already entered the realm of folklore. Old-timers in Tombstone would recount the story to journalists looking for color. One aging prospector told the Arizona Weekly Star, "I seen men go in with coin to spend, and I never seen them on the street again. No grave, no goodbye, just gone." Though the newspaper printed it alongside tall tales of buried treasure, the unease in his voice was noted. Local church records also preserved hints. Reverend Brooks, who lived long enough to be interviewed later in life, refused to speak plainly of the sisters, but he admitted, if any place bore the mark of sin upon its timbers, it was theirs. Historians of Tombstone's louder events, such as the OK Corral, seldom mention the barroom. Compared to the documented gunfight, these vanishings were harder to prove, harder to footnote. But buried in county ledgers and fragments of depositions, the outlines remained visible. Men who had arrived, lodged, and then disappeared without trace. It was not only records that kept the story alive. Neighbors spoke of strange sensations on the lot even after the fire. A shopkeeper recalled, "No one wanted to rent that ground. They said the soil was wrong, heavy somehow, as if it held things best left undisturbed." Even as modern businesses rose around Fremont Street, that parcel remained avoided. Some swore that children who dared to play there ran back pale and shaken, claiming they heard whispers beneath their feet. In time, the phrase that "Os" drifted quietly among miners became a saying attached to Tombstone's darker folklore. The sisters served more than whiskey. By the 1920s, when Tombstone was already leaning into its reputation as a frontier relic, a handful of academics began to look past the famous gunfight and into quieter records. Among them was Dr. Lionel Harper, a professor of anthropology at the University of Arizona. He traveled to Cochise County collecting oral histories, interviewing elderly residents who still remembered the 1880s. In his field notes, Harper remarked on how consistent the accounts of the sisters were, despite being told by different sources. He wrote, "The silence of the establishment is described by all. None recall laughter, none recall music. Its memory is of an absence, not a presence." For Harper, this pattern of testimony suggested that something beyond folklore might lie beneath the tale. Harper also examined ledgers and census fragments. He noted the recurring discrepancy. Names registered at the saloon or mentioned in passing by clerks that never appeared again in later records. His published article, though cautious, pointed to the unsettling possibility that these men did not simply move on. Meanwhile, the lot itself had become a kind of avoided ground. Locals told Harper that even decades after the fire, shopkeepers preferred not to build on it. One elderly resident explained, "The earth feels sour there. We plant, it won't grow. We build, it won't stand." Though this may have been coincidence or soil quality, Harper included it in his files as part of the folklore. Newspapers occasionally revived the story as a curiosity piece. A 1931 column in the Arizona Daily Star referenced the Silent Sisters of Tombstone in an article about frontier legends. The writer contrasted their mystery with the notoriety of the OK Corral, suggesting that what made their tale disturbing was precisely the lack of resolution. By then, the building was long gone, the site paved over. But for those who studied the town's history, the sisters represented a deeper unease, a reminder that Tombstone was not only a place of loud gunfights, but of quiet vanishings, harder to explain, harder to forget. By the mid-20th century, curiosity about the sisters had turned from folklore to research. Local historians began combing through surviving archives, hoping to find concrete names. But in every case, the trail was faint. Census rolls from 1880 list no clear matches. 2 women of the right age and description appear in Pima County records, but without family details. Marriage licenses, church registries, and even immigration logs offered nothing definitive. One archivist remarked in a margin note, "They appear suddenly like shadows, then vanish the same." Some theorized that the sisters were Irish immigrants who had passed through New Orleans before drifting westward. Others suggested they might have been from the Midwest, widows of soldiers seeking a livelihood on the frontier. Yet every attempt to pin them down ran into the same wall, the lack of verifiable surnames. Even law enforcement records proved elusive. The office of Sheriff John Behan left little beyond references to disputes with the Earps. The name of the saloon does not appear in his surviving files, though a deputy's unsigned affidavit, charred at the edges, makes reference to numbers not matching, men gone. This fragment has fueled speculation, but never provided answers. In 1954, a group of amateur genealogists in Tucson claimed to have found evidence of the sisters under new identities in El Paso. A wanted poster from 1884 described 2 women accused of swindling who bore resemblance to them. The resemblance, however, was subjective. No photograph of the Tombstone sisters was ever known to exist. Without images, the claim remained speculation. Still, the timing could not be ignored. The sudden disappearance from Tombstone in 1882, followed by rumors of women matching their description in Texas, created a possible line of escape. Others countered that such similarities were coincidences. After all, the frontier was filled with women running boarding houses and saloons. What remains striking is how little paper trail the sisters left in a town otherwise so well documented. Tombstone's famous gunfight has been dissected down to which boots each man wore, yet these women left almost nothing. It is their silence in the record that makes them stand out. For researchers, the puzzle remains frustrating. 2 figures who should be traceable by deed, census, or court record, yet who slip constantly through the cracks. Their legacy rests not on facts, but on the consistencies of rumor. The missing men, the cellar, the unease of every witness who crossed their threshold. As the historical trail grew colder, the legend of the sisters began to shift into the realm of ghost stories. By the 1960s, when tourists started arriving in Tombstone for reenactments of the OK Corral, guides were asked about other haunted places. Inevitably, someone mentioned the Twisted Barroom. Locals spoke of odd sensations on the vacant lot. Shopkeepers said that customers crossing it after dark sometimes felt a sudden chill, even in the heat of July. Children dared each other to run across the soil and claimed they heard faint whispers. One boy recalled, "It was like someone calling from under the ground, but when I looked back, no one was there." A rancher's wife, interviewed by a folklore society in 1968, said she avoided walking near the site entirely. "I cannot bear the feeling of being watched," she told the researcher. "It is as if 2 sets of eyes are still there, side by side." By then, the sister story had become a staple of oral tradition, told alongside tales of buried treasure and ghostly miners. But unlike fanciful yarns, this one always carried a sharper edge. The consistency of details, 2 women, a silent saloon, missing men, made it harder to dismiss entirely. A local newspaper revived the tale in a Halloween feature, describing the sisters as the quiet shadows of Fremont Street. The article exaggerated freely, inventing seances and spectral sightings, but it also reminded readers that genuine records of disappearances existed. This blend of fact and folklore only deepened the mystery. The sisters were no longer just figures of suspicion. They had become symbols of Tombstone's darker undercurrent, the shadow side of a town remembered mostly for its loudest gunfight. Still, among serious researchers, the story retained weight. University archives held onto fragments, Brooks's diary entries, Lowe's notebook, Briggs's testimony of reinforce, forked beams. These weren't ghost stories, but documents. Thin as they were, they gave the legend more foundation than most frontier hauntings. And so, while tourists filled Allen Street for staged shootouts, a quieter group of visitors asked instead about the women who served more than whiskey, and whether their footsteps could still be heard in the dust. One of the most intriguing fragments connected to the sisters surfaced not in Tombstone, but in a private collection in Tucson during the 1970s. Among papers donated by the descendants of a county clerk was a torn ledger page, browned with age, its ink faded but legible. The ledger did not record the usual purchases expected of a saloon. There were entries for flour, whiskey, kerosene, and lamp oil, but conspicuously absent were any purchases of meat. Despite this, the sisters were remembered for serving stew on most nights, thick and plentiful. What unsettled researchers most were the notations beside some entries. Alongside dates were sets of initials, sometimes just 2 letters, sometimes 3. At least 6 of those initials matched the first letters of names later listed as missing in Tombstone. One example read, J.H. 3 Nights. A prospector named James Holden, who vanished in 1881, carried those same initials. The page was not definitive evidence, but it provided a rare material link between rumor and record. Historians debated whether the initials were simply credit notes, markers of customers who owed payment. Others suggested something darker, a quiet tally of those who never left. The ledger fragment was examined under magnification, showing hurried handwriting, as if scrawled in secrecy. Portions were smudged, as though deliberately obscured. No other pages from the book have ever been located. For skeptics, the ledger proved nothing. For believers, it was confirmation that the whispers held truth, that the sisters were keeping track, not of debts, but of bodies. Either way, the fragment ensured the story of the twisted barroom could never be dismissed entirely as legend. It was too specific, too suggestive, and too aligned with the disappearances recorded in county notes. Even in its ambiguity, the ledger drew parallels with other frontier mysteries, where vanished travelers left only faint traces in documents. In Tombstone, however, the presence of the OK Corral in the same year cast a long shadow. One historian remarked, "In the noise of gunfire, the quiet crimes went unheard." The fragment sits today in a climate-controlled archive, rarely displayed. Researchers who have handled it often remark on the unease it stirs, an ordinary page, yet heavy with implications. By the mid-20th century, interest in frontier folklore surged, and researchers turned their attention to Cochise County families who had lived there for generations. In 1962, an oral history project collected interviews with elderly residents. Again and again, the sisters' story appeared, usually spoken with a quiet tone that suggested both memory and caution. One woman, born in 1888, recalled how her mother warned her as a child never to step onto the empty lot where the saloon once stood. "She told me," the woman explained, "that the ground itself was hungry, that it had swallowed men. Whether she believed it or not, I never knew, but I did not go near." Another account came from the grandson of a miner. He remembered being told that the sisters stood at their door watching miners walk by, selecting with their eyes who would be invited inside. "Grandfather said he never went near them," the man told interviewers. "He said their stares felt like hooks in the skin." These stories varied in detail, but shared the same refrain. The sisters served more than whiskey. The phrase had become a proverb of sorts, spoken by families when warning children to stay wary of strangers. At the same time, amateur historians began to sift through court dockets, church rolls, and newspaper clippings. What they found were gaps, people listed once, then never again. One researcher concluded that the sisters' legacy is not what is recorded, but what is missing. Though no physical trace of the saloon remained, the lot retained an aura of avoidance. Some residents swore that even weeds refused to take hold there, as though the soil resisted life. Whether this was exaggeration or poor land quality it reinforced the superstition. By the 1970s, ghost tours in Tombstone included a passing mention of the sisters, though guides rarely lingered. Tourists wanted the excitement of gunfights, and the unsettling quiet of vanishings. Yet those who dug deeper into the archives found themselves circling back to the same puzzle. Two women, nameless in official records, yet unforgettable in testimony. Their legend had survived not through the spectacle of bullets and notoriety, but through whispers, repeated across generations until it became part of the town's fabric. By the late 20th century, Tombstone had become almost entirely defined by its most famous moment, the gunfight at the OK Corral. Reenactments drew crowds, souvenir shops sold tin stars and toy revolvers, and the narrative of lawmen and outlaws became the town's lifeblood. Against that loud spectacle, the quieter tale of the sisters all but disappeared from tourist brochures. Yet in university archives and county historical societies, the traces remained. Scholars sorting through personal diaries and church records kept stumbling on the same pattern. Men noted as boarding at the sisters' place who never appeared in later roles. The fragments, though thin, formed a shadowy thread. One historian, writing in a small academic journal in 1982, remarked, "The Twisted Barroom may not rival the OK Corral in fame, but its legend endures precisely because of its silence. The absence of resolution is what makes it memorable." For locals, the story lingered in other ways. Residents who lived near the lot, by then covered in pavement, spoke of avoiding it at night. One shop owner explained to a researcher, "Business is good all around, but no one wanted to rent that corner. They said it felt wrong, even in daylight." Tourist maps highlighted saloons that had survived in brick and timber, like the Birdcage Theater. But when asked about the sisters, many guides grew uneasy. Some dismissed it as pure myth, while others admitted they preferred not to stir interest in that direction. Still, in private collections, diaries and affidavits were preserved. Reverend Brooks' journals, Deputy Lowe's notebook, Briggs's testimony of the reinforced beams, all survived in pieces, together forming a portrait that refused to fade. The story lived not in spectacle, but in margins, in the gaps of history, where the loudest voices had passed and only the faint echoes remained. And those echoes were enough to keep researchers coming back, determined to understand what had truly happened in that quiet, unsettling house on Fremont Street. What makes the sisters' story endure is not proof but ambiguity. Unlike the events at the OK Corral, where names, bullets, and minutes are all carefully catalogued, the story of the Twisted Barroom survives only in gaps and fragments. It is a narrative built from absence, missing men, missing records, a building erased by fire. Historians often argue that folklore thrives in silence. Where documents fail, memory fills the void, shaping rumors into legend. But with the sisters, the troubling part is how consistent those rumors are. Whether told by a miner in the 1880s, a professor in the 1920s, or a shopkeeper in the 1960s, the details rarely shift. Two women, a quiet saloon, disappearances that were never explained. One researcher wrote in 1991, "The Twisted Barroom demonstrates that what is not recorded can be as haunting as what is. It is an absence that accumulates weight." His study pointed out that while many frontier ghost stories change wildly across retellings, this one held to the same refrain: the silence of the saloon, the missing names, the cellar that no one entered willingly. In that way, the sisters represent a different face of Tombstone. The gunfighters of legend lived and died loudly, leaving behind scars on the town's identity. The sisters, by contrast, left whispers, disappearances and suspicions, too uncertain to prosecute, too consistent to forget. It is this contrast that unsettles modern readers. To accept the sisters' story is to accept that some crimes left no gunsmoke, no spectacle, just empty lines in ledgers and gaps in census rolls. Their silence was more disturbing than gunfire. Even today, some historians remain cautious. They argue the disappearances may have been coincidental, that drifters always vanish from frontier records, and that fear filled the blanks with sinister meaning. Yet others counter. If it were coincidence, why did That so many testimonies converge on the same house, the same women, the same quiet? It is the question that has no answer, which makes the tale so lasting. In recent decades, long after the saloon itself was gone, the site has continued to draw uneasy stories. The empty lot was eventually built over with modest storefronts, yet locals say the ground beneath carries its own weight. Hikers passing through Tombstone at night have reported sensations they couldn't quite explain. One described hearing faint footsteps pacing behind him on Fremont Street, only to turn and find no one there. Another claimed that when he stood near the lot, where the saloon once stood, the air grew noticeably cooler, despite the desert heat. Shopkeepers nearby also share quiet remarks. A woman who ran a store on the same block in the 1980s told an interviewer, "After dark, I always locked early. There's something about that patch of ground that makes you feel watched, as though two sets of eyes are still standing there, side by side." Some say photographs taken near the site develop with faint smudges or doubled outlines, as though two figures are standing in the background where no one was present. Though easy to dismiss as light exposure or dust on lenses, the consistency of these claims echoes the century-old testimonies. Ghost tours occasionally include the sisters now, though usually as a passing aside. Guides note the story hesitantly, aware that it unnerves listeners in a way stage shootouts never do. For tourists, it is one thing to hear of bullets in the street. It is another to imagine vanishing into silence, recorded only in gaps of ledgers and half-burnt affidavits. The legacy of the sisters is not confined to folklore alone. For researchers, the persistence of these accounts into the present shows how memory lingers, shaping itself generation after generation. The quiet mystery resists being forgotten. And in that way, the twisted barroom remains part of Tombstone's shadow, carried forward not by photographs or monuments, but by the same unease that has always surrounded it. The legacy of the twisted barroom rests not on fame but on absence. Unlike the OK Corral, which was immortalized in newspapers and court records, the sisters left almost nothing tangible behind. No photographs, no known surnames, no graves, only silence, broken by scattered testimonies and fragments of documents that survived fire and neglect. And yet, that silence is exactly what keeps their story alive. In a town built on loud spectacles of violence, their quiet menace lingers more deeply. Scholars note how unusual it is that multiple independent sources, miners, neighbors, a minister, even a mason, offered accounts that align so consistently. Each spoke of the same details: the oppressive quiet, the cellar door, the disappearances. To this day, no conclusive proof ties the sisters to crime. Skeptics argue the vanished men may have simply moved on, as drifters often did in frontier towns. But others counter that the coincidences pile too neatly. Always at the same establishment, always under the same roof, always under the watch of the same pale eyes. For Tombstone, a place celebrated for its gunfighters, the sisters represent something subtler and more insidious. They are a reminder that danger did not always come with bullets or blood on the street. Sometimes it came in the form of a quiet house, a bowl of stew, and the silence of women who asked no questions. Their disappearance from the records only sharpened their legend. Like smoke, they vanished, leaving behind a shadow that outlasted them. And while the OK Corral became reenactment, the twisted barroom became whisper, a darker kind of memory, impossible to stage, impossible to resolve. And so the story circles back to where it began. Tombstone, 1881, a year of gun smoke and headlines, of names etched into frontier legend. Yet, in the shadow of the OK Corral, another tale unfolded quietly, with no gunfire, no court transcripts, only the silence of a saloon where too many men vanished. The building itself is long gone, burned and paved over. The sisters left no trace but whispers, no proof but gaps in ledgers and memories that refuse to fade. Their story lingers because it cannot be solved. Every attempt to explain, whether wanderers who left unrecorded or murder carried out in secrecy, leads back to the same absence. Today, the lot holds no marker, no plaque to warn visitors of what once stood there. But locals still say that when the desert wind sweeps down Fremont Street, you can hear the rhythm of footsteps pacing just beyond sight, measured, deliberate, as if business were still being conducted below. Some believe it is only the imagination, stirred by stories told too many times. Others insist the ground remembers. What no one can do is prove either way. And that is the final weight of the twisted barroom, not the certainty of law, not the spectacle of violence, but the unresolved unease of a forgotten case file, where the silence speaks louder than any bullet. In Tombstone, the gunfight lives on in history books, but the sister's house remains in whispers, an echo that refuses to die, reminding us that some mysteries never leave, they only wait in the dust.